Hello. Good evening, everyone. I have the pleasure of interrupting all of your existing conversations and then trying to be lovely enough that you don't really mind it coming from me. So that's the plan. Welcome. It's lovely to have you with us in the room and on the stream. If you are on the stream, you can text us on our Q&A number, which I'm commandeering for this purpose. Text us and let us know how many of you are watching together and where you are. We'd love to know what's going on. Speaking of the Q&A, we have a number for you to text, so that applies in the room as well as on the stream. If you think of a question, do text it before you forget it. So if anything takes your interest, you can text in at any time. Those questions will come to us. And we'll pick them up at the end in the Q&A session. We also have a Linktree code, I think. There should be a Linktree link if you're on YouTube. That should be below the video. And we have a Linktree code. So if you scan that code, it will take you to some of our resources. But very, very importantly, the button at the top is a feedback form. If you can take 2 minutes at some point during the evening to just fill that in, it really, really, really helps us. So please, please do that. And then I get to introduce our speakers for this evening, which is great. So, Professor John Lennox, Emeritus Professor in Mathematics, Emeritus Fellow in the Philosophy of Science at Oxford University, a man who has written extensively at the interface of science, philosophy and religion, including this very book, Can Science Explain Everything?, which is obviously the inspiration for our title this evening. So it seemed like he would be the expert to ask that question too. So it should be great chatting to him. Now, he had planned to be with us, but unfortunately, he's had a bit of a health emergency. He had a cancerous lump that he had to have removed from behind his ear, and he has been asked to look after himself at home and isolate. But he's really keen to be with us, and so he's joining us via video link. Here he is. He's on the screen. Fantastic. Welcome, John. Thank you so much for joining us. And
thank you very much.
Wonderful. And this is Reverend Andy Weatherly from Grace Church Sturchley, who is going to conduct the interview with John Lennox, which means that I am about to disappear and pop up later. But just a quick reminder, you can text in your questions at any time, and you can use the Linktree at any time. And if you're on YouTube, you can use the chat at any time. So we really love a bit of audience interaction from you. And now I'm going to disappear. Andy.
Thank you very much, Louise. And let me also add my welcome to you this evening. Thank you very much for joining us, both here in the room and also at home. And welcome also to you, John. And we're very sad that you can't be here in person, but we're delighted that you are able to join us via the wonders of Zoom. Caught some of the lunchtime programme. We'll be repeating, John and I haven't had a conversation about it, but I will be repeating some of the questions that I asked John at lunchtime, but we've got a much longer time this evening to go through things. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, John, and addressing a whole load of things that we didn't have time to talk about at lunchtime. So just delighted that we'll have some time now. And I wanted to let you sort of introduce yourself a little bit more. Just tell us a little bit, if you can, John, about maybe your family, your background. And I guess I'm just quite intrigued. We'll hear in a moment from your accent that you're from Northern Ireland. And I don't know whether you come from a long line of mathematicians. So maybe if you can tell us a little bit about where you're from and a little bit about your journey to both mathematics and to God.
Well, thank you very much, and I do apologise to the audience that I'm not present in Birmingham. I was really looking forward to it, but the medics decided that I shouldn't go, and they must be obeyed. But it is a pleasure to be with you to discuss this topic, which has been for many years of great fascination to me. And as you can now tell from my accent, which I don't seem to be able to disguise, nor do I want to, I come originally from Armagh in Northern Ireland. And I am the eldest in a family of four. My father ran a small town store employing perhaps 30, 40 people at max. I don't really remember. But my parents were rather exceptional people, although I'm saying that myself because in a country that's been riven by sectarian violence that was really growing at the time that I became a teenager and was at in sixth form at school, my father pursued a policy which made him popular because he decided to employ people from both sides of the divide, both Protestants and Catholics. And as a result, my brother was nearly killed. And so terrorism came very close to us. And I asked him why he did it and why take this risk. And he said the biblical worldview, the Christian worldview, teaches us that all men and women, irrespective of their worldview, are made in the image of God, and I intend to treat them like that. Now, that was a very powerful lesson for a young person to see that his parents had this kind of a moral concept and they lived it. So my first experience of Christianity was a very living one. But the second thing that my parents did for me was they loved me enough to allow me to and that wasn't always the case. Sad to say, in a country where there was a lot of bigotry, religious prejudice, and all of this. But they introduced me to a Christianity that was open, fresh, inquiring, and it never occurred to me that the Christian faith closed people's minds down, whereas atheism opened their minds up. It was the exact reverse in my experience. And at school, I got interested in anything to do with the concept of language. And that's probably why I finally settled on mathematics. But I was interested first in becoming a classicist and then a modern linguist. But I was at that kind of school where you had to give up science if you did two ancient languages or two modern languages. And I didn't want to sacrifice science, and I'm very glad I didn't. So I ended up concentrating on mathematics and was encouraged by my school to have a go at Cambridge. And I got into Cambridge. But I was always interested in the big questions. Where does mathematics fit into science? Where does science fit into the big picture? Does it tell us everything, as is in the title of my book, which is unfortunately a very widespread idea today? And those early thoughts, I got deeply interested in philosophy at the age of about 14. So I was asking the big questions, and I was so fortunate to have parents who didn't only encourage me to explore the Christian worldview. I need to make that clear. They said if I'm going to really think through things, I need to encounter other worldviews. And I'm so thankful they did that. It was a mind expanding background. And this was coming from parents, neither of whom had had a higher education. So it was amazing. And to my mind, it was consistent with their Christian commitment to be as open as that.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. And we'll come back to your personal story a little bit later on, I hope, in the interview. But tonight, right now, I want us to focus on the question that is really at the centre of the event this evening. Can science explain everything? And I wanted to ask you whether you think people do generally think that science can explain everything, and to ask you whether, when you went off to go to Cambridge to study mathematics, whether you had an expectation that science was the thing that would help you make sense of everything in the world.
Well, it's fairly widespread in our culture as a result of people like Richard Dawkins and Stephen, and they espouse a view that these days is called scientism. Science is the only way to truth. Everything else is mythology and fairy stories and of no interest to a rational person. But I never was in the slightest danger of thinking that, because I'd read so much that refuted it, even from a very early age. First of all, it seemed to me logically that the statement, can science explains everything, refutes itself, because that is not a statement that science gives us, that science explains everything. So if it's true, it's actually false, and therefore it's logically incoherent. But it might be too late at night for that kind of logic. So let's look at this another way. Science is extremely powerful, and I love science and some of its spin-offs, like the technology we're using this evening. We're very grateful for it, and the development of COVID vaccines and all this kind of thing. Science has given us a great deal, but it's powerful because it's actually limited. Now, it's sometimes fashionable to say that science answers the how questions, and religion, philosophy, literature, and so on answer the why questions. That's almost right, I think. But science, it's the why of function as distinct from the why of purpose. Why is that pipe here? Why is that blood vessel there? And so on. And science has been brilliant in elucidating the what and the why of purpose. Now, it's easy to see that science cannot answer all questions. Let me give you a simple illustration. Suppose my Aunt Matilda, fictitious of course, has baked a lovely cake, and you in the audience are all Nobel Prize winners. I hope, by the way, there is a future Nobel Prize winner in the audience. And I ask you as the MC to analyze this cake. Well, of course, we'll get some brilliant analyses. We'll have the chemist reducing it to atoms and basic chemicals, the physicist telling us about elementary particles, and so on. And we get a complete scientific description of the cake. And I thank you all for that. And then I say, before we conclude this evening, can you tell me why she made the cake? And at that point, Aunt Matilda begins to grin, because of course she knows why she made the cake, but she remains silent. And I asked the physicist, Nobel Prize winner, why did she make the cake? And of course, he or she must admit that physics can't tell us that, neither can chemistry, neither can any of the natural sciences. And it's pretty obvious that we'll never know why she made the cake unless she reveals it to us by telling us. Now, here's a very important thing. It's a very simple and down-to-earth illustration, but it helps us understand something. When she tells us, that is, when she reveals it to us, we do not switch off our reason at that point. No, we use it to see if her explanation makes sense. If she said, I made it for the man in the moon, we would be very skeptical. If she said she made it for her cousin Jim, and we know she has a cousin Jim, we would accept her explanation. Now let's ratchet that up to the size of the universe. You see, science can tell us the hows and the why of function, but it can't tell us why the universe was made unless the creator of the universe, if there is one, reveals it to us. We shall never know. And the central claim of the biblical worldview, and in particular Christianity, is that God, the creator, has revealed to us why he made it. And just to ram that home from another perspective, Sir Peter Medawar was a very distinguished natural scientist in Oxford, and he was set dead against this scientism, that science can explain everything. And he said, look, it's very obvious that science cannot answer every question. It can't even answer what he called Karl Popper's questions, the simple questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going? And what is the meaning of life? He said we've got to go outside the natural sciences to literature, philosophy, and I would want to add theology, in order to get answers to those questions. And I would also add that the answers given by literature, philosophy, religion, and all kinds of other disciplines like history are rational answers. Science, and I would want to emphasize this in the sense of the natural sciences, is not coextensive with rationality. And sadly, that is a popular idea that fuels the scientism notion that science can explain everything. So that's a rough explanation of what is going on here.
Thank you, John. Well, I want to press you a little bit on this then. If it's a question of just that science is explaining the whats and the hows, but not the whys, why do you think there's a perception that Christianity and science or faith and science are in conflict with one another? Because there is a common perception that religion, any sort of belief system, any sort of religious belief system, has to give way as our understanding of the universe has grown, that it's religion and religious perceptions that have to give way to science and rationality.
Well, we need to tease this out a little bit because there are potential sources of deep confusion here. Let's make very clear that faith is not, peace be to Richard Dawkins, a religious word that simply means believing where there's no evidence. That's a definition of blind, in my book, is very dangerous indeed. But faith in English is an ordinary word. It comes from the Latin fides, and it means trust. And in ordinary life, we don't trust everything we read in the newspapers. We don't trust every person we meet because we look for evidences that what we read or the people we meet are trustworthy. In other words, thinking about it for a moment, we all know what is meant by evidence-based faith. That's point number one. Point number two is that faith is as involved in science as it is in religion or in ordinary life. Einstein once said, I cannot imagine a genuine scientist without that faith. Now, he did not mean faith in God. He meant the faith, the basic credo of every scientist I've ever met. You cannot do science, or you won't do science, unless you believe that science can be done. And putting that slightly differently, unless you believe that the universe is accessible by the human mind, at least in part. That is, it's rationally intelligible. And every scientist has that faith. So all scientists are people of faith. I think the key question to ask when the word faith is used is simply to say faith in what? What are we talking about having faith in? Because everyone has faith in something. Otherwise, we couldn't exist. So that is the first thing. Now, there is a perception that religious faith, belief in a given religion, and what is shown to us by the natural sciences is in conflict. I want to argue that that is not quite the case, in the sense that there have been perceived conflicts. The story of Galileo, for example, and go into this if you like, but the current thinking on those two iconic historical incidents is that they cannot be used as evidence that religion and science are in conflict. Taking Galileo as the simpler of the two, Galileo was a believer in God when he started and when he finished. And the issue with Galileo originally was conflict not with the church in the beginning, but with the philosophers who believed Aristotle's notion that the earth did not move. So the conflict is not quite what it seemed. A simple reflection on, let's say, the Nobel Prize for Physics can help us see where the conflict really lies, because there is a conflict. The Nobel Prize for Physics some years ago was won by Peter Higgs for his prediction of the Higgs boson. Now, Peter Higgs is an atheist, and some years before, the Nobel Prize for Physics was won by a very eminent American physicist who is a believer in God, a Christian, in fact, whom I have met to discuss these things. Now, these two men, what separates them? Well, certainly not their physics. They're both at the very top of the tree. But they are separated by their worldview. And what I want to say is we'll never understand this debate if we don't realize that the fundamental conflict is not between science and God, it is between atheism and theism. And there are scientists on both sides. So I like to put it this way, that the real question we have to ask is, where does science point? Is it neutral? Does it point towards atheism, as Richard Dawkins and Stephen Hawking claim? Or does it point towards God? And I want to argue that there's very strong reason for thinking that science points toward God, beginning with the history of science, the rise of modern science in the 16th and 17th centuries under Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and then later Clerk Maxwell and people like Faraday and Babbage and so on. All of them believed in God. And that is such an interesting historical fact that it has given rise to a great deal of writing. And C.S. Lewis summed up the view of Alfred North Whitehead, arguably one of the most famous philosophers of science, and he summed it up this way. He said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator, a lawgiver. In other words, the faith in God that Isaac Newton had and Kepler had, and so on, far from hindering their science, was the very motor that drove it. And here the Bible comes into play, because the Bible taught that there is an intelligent creator. It also taught that the universe is contingent. God could make it any way he liked. So if you want to find out exactly what's going on, you have to go and look. And so there's very strong historical evidence that links faith in God with the rise of modern science. Let me put it quite provocatively. I'm not ashamed, not remotely ashamed, of being both a scientist of a sort, if you'll allow mathematicians to be scientists, and a Christian, because arguably it was the biblical worldview that gave me my subject in the first place. So I see that they work well together. Now, being even more provocatively, and you can pick me up on this if you like, I think that science and God sit very well together. But I'm not sure that science and atheism sit very well together. In fact, I think atheism undermines science.
Okay, so that has left me very intrigued, and I now want to ask you questions about substantiating that. So I will, in a second, come back to that, John. But first, I wanted to focus in on some of the areas where Christianity is perceived to be in conflict with science. I wanted to ask you about a question about origins, really, of why anything is here at all. And if I could put the question provocatively, what is wrong? What is so flawed with the idea of the Big Bang Theory that Christians hold to an idea of creationism that is just antiquated and anti-scientific? It's pre-modern. It doesn't have a place in the world. How do you reconcile these things together as a scientist?
Well, first of all, we need to make clear what we're talking about. Creationism these days has changed its meaning. It used to mean belief in a creator, But now it tends to mean a very specific interpretation of the early chapters of Genesis with a young earth and this kind of thing. But if we stop for a moment with the idea of the creator and the Big Bang, there's no conflict at all. The words Big Bang were coined by Sir Fred Hoyle as a kind of joke, you and your Big Bang, because he did not, from science itself in the 1960s, and I can remember it well, that the universe had a beginning in a space-time singularity. So that Big Bang is in one sense a label on a mystery, but it is an assertion that the universe had a beginning. But that's exactly what the Bible has been saying. Now, cosmologists and physicists have spelt this out in some detail in their standard model of the universe. And it seems to me that a Christian, someone who believes as I do in the biblical record, has absolutely nothing to. If you want to call it a bang, that's fine, but I would want to know what exactly went bang, what was the cause behind it, and so on. Then the opinions differ, of course, even among the scientists. And these days, it's very often you will meet the idea that there's nothing behind it. So that the ultimate choice is the extreme one between God and nothing. But having spent quite a lot of time and writing about the idea of a universe that creates itself from nothing, in the words of Stephen Hawking, I find that explanation frankly ludicrous. And if you like, I can explain why. But the first point is the idea a beginning is not antiquated or primitive in any way. True, it's been in the Bible, and most of the Bible is pre-modern scientific by sheer historic definition. But the fact that in the beginning, the very first words of Genesis, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, that's stating there was a beginning. There was an intelligent cause behind it. There's nothing in science, as far as I know, that prevents that making any sense. In fact, I believe that contemporary science gives a great deal of evidence for its truth. So we must separate the claim that there was a beginning coming from both the science and the biblical worldview, various interpretations of Genesis that do conflict with the standard model of the universe being 14, 4 or 5 billion years old. That clearly conflicts with the idea of a young Earth, and that has to be investigated in its own right. And I've got plenty to say about that as well, because I think, although it's possible to interpret the Bible that way, you don't have to. You don't have to provoke a conflict where one isn't actually there in the text.
So a second area that I really wanted to focus into, again, is around evolution. So that's a common perception of where Christianity would be in conflict with a scientific view of the world. And again, isn't that area of conflict very real, because Darwinism effectively undercuts the Christian claim that there's a distinction between humanity and the other creatures. And you know, how do you reconcile those things as a Christian and a scientist?
Well, let me first of all say I'm not a biologist, but I do read a great deal of biology because, of course, as a Christian, I'm very interested in this question. And it seems to me, having spent some years studying it and having recently written a pretty major book on it called Cosmic Chemistry, Do God and Science Mix? It seems to me there are several things to be teased out here. First of all, what do we mean by evolution? Evolution has 4 or 5 different meanings, and I can't begin to give a lecture on that, but simply to say that the most innocuous meaning is change, and we can see change in nature. Then there is the Darwinian mechanism, so-called. That is natural selection plus the neo-Darwinian add-on of mutation, a number of other things. those mechanisms, if indeed they are mechanisms, certainly do something. Darwin brilliantly observed what happened to finches in the Galapagos Islands when the weather conditions went through cycles of drought and plentiful rain. And the finch beak lengths tend to shorten or lengthen according to the availability of nuts of different sizes and so on. Now, if you want to call that evolution, well, it's established. We can see it happening in nature all the time. But for me, looking at this topic in some detail, the controversy begins with the claim that mutation and natural selection do everything. Now, if I query that as a mathematician from outside the biological field, nobody would take me seriously. But we're living in very interesting days because the whole neo-Darwinian thesis is being put under a rigorous inspection and it's coming up wanting. I've been very interested and attended seminars by Professor Dennis Noble, Fellow of the Royal Society at Oxford, who is regarded, quite rightly, as the father of systems biology. And what Dennis Noble said not so long ago was that the neo-Darwinian thesis, it's often called the modern synthesis, doesn't need to be modified. It needs to be replaced because it doesn't do the job. So I'm fascinated to watch this space because leading biologists, who many of them belong to what's called the third way in biology, and are systems biologists, are challenging so many aspects of the neo-Darwinian thesis that very big questions are to be asked. So if leading scientists are questioning this thesis, we need to be very careful before we swallow it hook, line, and sinker, and then claim that it negates Christianity. Now, I am well aware there are people that, like Dan Dennett, who think that Darwinism is a corrosive acid and it destroys any possibility of belief in God. But you know, theology is not in the same category. And you cannot argue atheism from a biological theorem. From an abstract philosophy and a theistic one, God can create things and make things any way he likes. And the use of randomness and natural selection, all this kind of thing, must be allowable because we see these things actually happening. The real issue at stake is any of this guided? And often the subtext of the discussion on evolution is that evolution is an unguided natural process that has no goal in mind. Now, there are many leading biologists in the world who are Christians, and they will accept to quite a large degree that the evolutionary processes that we have observed account for everything, but they believe that behind them there stands the guiding hand of God. And that's where a huge conflict lies. Obviously, it's the interpretation of the scientific data. But as I say, the whole thing is in flux. Watch this space. And if you want to know more about my take on it, then cosmic chemistry has just come out. And I go through this in major detail. But what I'm absolutely convinced about is at whatever level, whatever evolution does or doesn't do, there's one thing it cannot do, and that is it cannot explain the origin of life. That's, in a sense, the elephant in the intellectual sitting room. For years, Dawkins' blind watchmaker thesis held huge sway, and he's a brilliant writer, no question. And the central thesis of that book, and I can't quote it absolutely word perfectly, but he said that the blind unconscious mechanism that Darwin discovered of natural selection accounts for the existence and the variation of all species of life. He later had to retract the first part of that because it's rather blindingly obvious that evolution cannot account for the existence of life for the simple reason that evolution, whatever it does or doesn't do, depends on the existence of life to do anything. So the whole question of the origin of life, which is almost equivalent to the origin of information that we have in the genetic code, that's the fascinating question. And we're really no further on that one than we were in 1953. But that's another topic, but it's very important to keep them separate. Biology is an absolutely fascinating subject, and in a sense, I would fancy doing another degree in molecular biology, but it's too late, so I read the books instead.
Thanks, John. I know that you've said there that biology and Christianity swim in slightly different pools, and therefore it's slightly unfair to use one to totally discount the other. One area, though, where there is very significant overlap is in the whole area of truth, and how do we know what's true and what's not true? And again, I wanted to ask you a question really about your take on the Bible and how you can take seriously the words of the Bible, because central to the Bible is so comfortable talking about miracles, non-repeatable events that violate the laws of nature. And the whole of Christianity, of course, is predicated on the back of the resurrection, a more dramatic and miraculous non-repeatable event you cannot find. So how do you expect us, as a scientist, to take seriously the words of the Bible as a credible source of truth?
Well, I expect people to understand it when they've worked out what the laws of nature are and what they are not. That idea that you quoted, that miracles violate the laws of nature and therefore no rational person can accept them, is due essentially to David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher. And I've been very years because on reading him directly, his original work, it struck me that there was something very wrong in his logic. And I later came across C.S. Lewis's explanation of it and various other people, including the one-time leading interpreter of David Hume, and that's Anthony Flew, whom I was able to interview not long before his death. And Anthony Flew told me that he'd been wrong about Hume's take on miracles. And he said, unfortunately, I would have to change all my books and I won't be able to do that. It was an extremely honest and humble statement by one of Britain's leading philosophers, who was, in one sense, the Richard Dawkins of his day. So let's look at it for a minute. You see, miracles violate the laws of nature. Now, the word violate reminds me of the traffic signs I see in the United States. Violators will be towed. In other words, if you park at this place, you're going to have your car towed away and you will have to pay a fine. And the laws of nature, what exactly are they? Now, to illustrate it, Lewis gives us, as usual, a brilliantly simple and powerful illustration. I was hoping to come to Birmingham, and I might well have stayed overnight in a hotel, like I did last time. Suppose I put £100 in the drawer of my room tonight, and another 100 tomorrow night. That means I've got £200 in my drawer according to the laws of arithmetic. Now, if I wake up on the third morning and clear my possessions and open the drawer and I find £50 there, what do I assume has happened? Do I think that the laws of arithmetic have been broken? That 1 + 1 equals 2 yesterday, but it only equals a half today, so to speak? Or do I think that the laws of England have been broken? Now, clearly, I think the laws of England have been broken. How do I know that? Because I know the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. It's the laws of arithmetic that point out to me that something extra has intervened within the system. Philosophically, my mistake was to imagine that my hotel room was a closed system of cause and effect. But it wasn't. It was an open system, and a thief was able to come in and put their hand into the drawer and take out £150. That didn't break the laws of arithmetic, but it certainly broke the laws of England. And I think the main problem here is that we get confused about the nature of law. We're thinking of it from the perspective of jurisprudence and the laws of the land, whereas the laws of nature are the regularities that we observe, and we encapsulate them in mathematical formulae like Kepler's laws of planetary motion and so on. Take Newton's law of gravity, which is perhaps the most famous law. It tells me that if I drop an apple, then it will fall towards the center of the earth. But that doesn't prevent you catching it, so it doesn't even hit the ground. In other words, the laws tell us what and predict what will happen, provided that the system is completely closed. And so the real issue is this: the atheist or materialist, more accurate, believes that our universe is a closed system of cause and effect. I don't believe it is. I believe it is a creation by an intelligent and powerful God who can feed new events into it. Now, I don't believe all claims to miracle, and I would want to confine myself, for the sake of explanation, to the miracles in the New Testament, and in particular the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which is, as you said, the central message of Christianity. Now, if I, as a Christian, were saying to you that Jesus rose from the dead by natural processes going on in his tomb, then we would be breaking the laws of nature. But I'm not claiming that at all. I'm claiming that God intervened and raised him from the dead by feeding colossal power of a kind we know nothing about into the system and bringing him back to life. That is a very different thing, and that breaks no laws at all. Science has nothing to say about that. So what happens here is that demolishing David Hume opens the way for a scientist to believe in the resurrection, as many of our leading scientists do. You would be amazed how many they are in the University of Oxford here. But then you've got to ask, of any particular claim, like the resurrection of Jesus, what is the evidence that it happened? Now, it's a singular event. It's a unique event in history. You can't repeat it. But you have to approach it as a historical thing by forensic methods. You have to investigate it like a detective investigates a murder. Inspector Morse and Lewis are very popular down here in Oxford. And when Morse finds a murder victim, he doesn't say, well, let's run the thing again to see what happened. He can't do that. So he has to conduct what is called the best explanation, the best possible explanation that will enable him to decide from what he can see and the clues he can get who was the guilty party. So I believe that we can approach the resurrection of Jesus Christ from a forensic perspective historically, and that's been done by many people. And indeed, some people who decided that the resurrection was the heart of Christianity and they could easily prove it to be wrong, upon investigation, they became Christians. When I was younger, a famous book called Who Moved the Stone, written by a journalist, did exactly that. So there's a historical investigation, but of course there's also one in terms of our experience, because if Jesus has been raised from the dead, he is alive. And that raises the question of encounter with him, which is a slightly different topic.
Well, I want to move on and ask you a few more personal questions. But before I do that, I'm going to go back to your provocative statement earlier. I should also just say, if you're here in the room, don't forget to text in questions. And if you're watching along at home, you can. That number also obviously works for you. So if you do, if the things that John has raised and be talking about, and it's prompting questions, feel free to get your phone out and text those in now. You're welcome to do that. You don't have to wait until the end of our time. John, go on then. I want to say our bite. Okay, go on. You said very provocatively earlier that there was a potential conflict between atheism and science. And go on, tell us a little bit more about that, because I would suggest, I would put it to you that the common perception is that it's actually, there are a great number of scientists who are atheists, and the common perception would be, actually it's those scientists, not the ones who come from a faith perspective, who are unencumbered by religious sentiment or prior convictions to a creator, who are more likely to pursue where the evidence actually leads them. So go on, tell us where you think the conflict might lie between atheism and science.
Well, first of all, atheism is a faith perspective. Let's not forget that, as is Christianity. And if we want to approach this question, excuse me a moment. I would put it this way. Let's go through a little experiment I do often when I meet a scientist. And I've done this with many people, some of whom are very well known. And I ask them, what do you do science with? And they start by talking about a machine. And I say, no. Oh, they say, you mean, they're about to say the mind, most of them, when they realize that's not quite politically correct these days in science. And because they think the mind is the brain, which I don't, but that's another topic. And I say, okay, you do science with your brain. Tell me the brief history of the brain. And they'll come up with the usual kind of Darwinian theory. They'll say the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided natural process. And I look at them and I say, and you trust it? I say, tell me honestly now, if you knew or believed that the computer that you use in your laboratory was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? Now, here's the very interesting thing. I have always got the answer after a little bit of hesitation. No, I would not. So I look at them and I say, you've got a problem, haven't you? Because your explanation of the origin of the human rational capacity undermines rationality. Now, this is an argument that C.S. Lewis talked about years and years ago, but what is very interesting today is that there are two very powerful minds in the world of philosophy that are advancing it once more. The first is a Christian philosopher, Alvin Plantinga, in the United States, but the second is an atheist philosopher, and that's Thomas Nagel, who wrote one of the most provocatively titled books I've ever read. It's called Mind and Cosmos, and the subtitle is something like Why the Neo-Darwinian Understanding of the World is Almost Certainly False. And in that book, he's arguing exactly this. If you give that kind of reductionist explanation of the brain and the mind and reduce thinking simply to the motions of atoms in the brain, in the end, you destroy all meaning. And you're undermining any possibility of trusting the very rationality you need to do science, let alone the rationality you need to believe in God. And that's what I mean, that atheism is undermining science when taken to its logical conclusion. And I see no way around that other than making a vast leap of unjustifiable faith, or else abandoning that theory and saying there's something seriously wrong here.
I'd like to move away from simply just talking about some of the scientific things. I want to ask you a couple of questions really about suffering. And the first one is really a question about suffering and science specifically. Because I think you can make a contrast between religion and science when looking at suffering. Let me put it to you like this. You grew up in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. You mentioned at the start just how much your brother was directly affected by that. And doesn't that kind of illustrate the sectarianism that shows the real fruit of religion that you and your family lived through. And then and that sectarianism went on for decades and decades. And then contrast what we've just been through with coronavirus over the last 2 years, and how it's science that has been our saviour. It's delivered vaccines, medicines that provided a very real way out. So I want to provocatively put to you, take us through, because it looks to me from that it's religion that causes suffering and it's science that alleviates suffering. How do you answer things like that?
Well, in several directions. First of all, certainly religion has caused suffering, but at the Christian level, it's a false understanding of Christianity that's behind it. And on the science side, science has given us wonderful vaccines and all this kind of thing, and has saved us in this situation. But science has also given us the vastly capable rockets and weapons that are destroying people in their thousands in Ukraine today. So there are two sides, and we need to keep a balance. Let's come to the first side. And I'm often asked, you're quite right, coming from Northern Ireland, people say, how can you possibly be a Christian when your country is divided by people fighting over Christianity? I mean, that's absolutely absurd. Well, my reaction to that fighting and those troubles is the first thing to say, and I'm saying this very honestly, folks, I'm utterly ashamed of it. Utterly ashamed of it. I'm ashamed of it, and I need to explain why I'm ashamed of it. I'm utterly ashamed that the name of Christ has ever been associated with an AK-47 or a bomb or a machine gun. Why? Because Christ repudiated the use of violence to propagate his message. Now, this is hugely important. I often wondered why there was so much in the New Testament about the trial of Jesus and not simply about his death and resurrection, until one day I realized that he was accused of being a terrorist in contemporary terms. And because that was such a sensitive issue at the time, the Roman governor decided to conduct the trial himself. And he was determined to unearth whether Jesus was a terrorist or not. And he put it to him in a question: are you the king? Are you against me politically? And Jesus answered, went roughly like this: yes, you say I'm a king, but I'm not a king in the sense that you mean, because my kingdom is not of this world. And you can see that by the fact that my servants have not been fighting. My kingdom is not from here. And the interesting thing is, Pilate would have had a report on his desk from the centurion leading the arrest party for Jesus that Jesus had not resisted arrest. And when one of his disciples rather foolishly had taken a sword and cut off the high priest's servant's ear, Jesus had put the ear back on. And by the way, that's a very interesting incident reported by Luke, who was a doctor. I believe this is another miracle, but it's also an acted parable, because I notice, and it lies behind your question, that wherever in the world people have taken guns and weapons and violent methods to promote Christ's message, they've cut the ears of people and people won't listen anymore. I notice Jesus repaired the ear so that the man could hear. And in a sense, in trying to answer your question, I'm in the ear repairing business. We'll not hear what Jesus is saying until we realize that he was dead against the kind of thing that people criticize in false versions of Christianity. And I once said to the late Christopher Hitchens, Christopher, if you understood how much Jesus was against the kind of thing that you're against, you'd be on his side. You wouldn't be fighting against him. You see, to cut it down, and let me be completely open, people who take weapons to defend Christ or his message or to propagate it aren't Christian. They're not following directly against what he said. And what he said to Pilate finally on that issue was, to this end I was born, to this end I came into the world, that I might bear witness to the truth. And Pilate said, perhaps not so cynically as many people think, what is truth? And he went out and declared Jesus to be innocent, because Pilate was shrewd enough to know what we all know, that one of the things you cannot do, you cannot impose truth by force. And that's a hugely important thing. So what I want to say is it's pseudo-Christianity that acts violently, but Jesus didn't do that, nor did he act like that, and he taught completely differently. And if we want to know what the Christian attitude is, then we need to see how he behaved. And that's hugely important, because the Roman governor publicly exonerated Jesus from the charge of being a violent terrorist. And he nevertheless crucified him because he gave in to the clamoring of a pretty vitriolic and agitated crowd that wanted Jesus done away with. So this is a very important element, it seems to me, in understanding what Christianity claims.
Thanks, John. Our time is almost done. Louise is going to come and start with the Q&A in a moment, but I want to ask one final question, if I can. Just sticking with the question of suffering, which I guess I've asked the first question, which was really more around the philosophical problem of suffering. But I wanted to ask you more specifically and personally, what difference being a Christian has made for you. And if I could be really personal, you've had a cancer diagnosis very recently. It's why you can't be here. And through that, the last few weeks, have you had a flutter of doubt or fear that your faith is just a comfort? And have you found it through your own personal suffering a stretch? Has there been challenge to your faith that you've experienced?
Well, the answer to the last point is no, and to the earlier point is yes, in the sense that no, I haven't doubted at all, because I have that confidence that as Jesus rose from the dead, one day I'll be raised from the dead, and whether COVID gets me or cancer, it doesn't in the end make a great deal of difference. I know that one day I shall die unless Christ comes in the meantime, and that's another topic, of course. The problem of suffering and evil is the hardest problem I face, though. And that is being totally open, and we need to be. But here again, it seems to me that Christianity comes in with something very real. Now, you mentioned the question of comfort. The fact that my Christian faith in God comforts me is not evidence that it's false. It's what you would expect if it's true. It just doesn't prove anything. The fact that some people feel atheism is comfortable because it means they are never going to have to face God doesn't prove that atheism is true either. That Freudian argument is hopeless because it cuts both ways, but we needn't go into that now. I've done that thoroughly in one of my books. Let's come back to the suffering thing. Where does Christianity help? Where atheism doesn't. And I mean atheism doesn't because this idea of evil in the world, the problem is that many of my atheist friends will really be anti-Christian because of suffering and evil, and yet they can give me no explanation where evil comes from and what the difference is between good and evil, if everything's relative and so on. Now, I don't want to go down the philosophical tack. I want to come to the central thing here, because what Christianity shows me is a God who suffers. And if you can come along with me for a moment, and I often say to folks, just listen for a moment to what Christianity claims before you reject it. That's very important. At the heart of Christianity is not only a resurrection, but a death that preceded it, a death on the cross of the person who claimed to be God incarnate. Now, if that's God on the cross, what does that mean? Well, at the very, very least, it means that God has not remained distant from the problem of human suffering, but has himself become part of it. Now, if the cross were the end, had been the end, we'd never have heard of Jesus. But what transforms the whole question for me is the resurrection. Because in Jesus' resurrection, there is, as he promised, those of us who believe in him, of our own resurrection, so that as he transcended death, broke through the death barrier, there's a day coming when he will raise me from the dead if I've died in the meantime. And you know, in this modern technological world, it fascinates me that people are trying to conquer death by physical means. They're trying to upgrade in the end human beings and upload them onto silicon so that they can live forever, when all the time their deepest longings have already been solved. Jesus has conquered death, and Jesus promises to anyone who trusts him and accepts him and follows him as Lord, that he will load them, if I might use that language, one day into a world where there is no suffering, no pain, and no death. Now that's real hope. And it's absolutely marvelous. I was telephoned just before this conversation by a friend of over 50 years in Germany, whose husband had just died. And I said to her, "You're going to see him again." She said, "I know, and it gives me such huge comfort." And if I may speak very personally, not only have I had a little bit of cancer diagnosed, which they may or may not have excised, I nearly died a few years ago, about 14 years ago, when my heart, one of the valves, one of the arteries seized up. And it was so serious, I had to say goodbye to my wife. And the interesting thing is that in those moments, I had complete peace. Now, that's what I would expect if Christianity is true. It doesn't prove it's true, but it's consistent with its truth. And you know, one of the criteria of truth that you're taught in any basic philosophy class is that it is consistent. It gives you a consistent story, and it relates directly to the reality as you perceive it. Now, the problem of suffering raises many more questions than that, which is why I wrote my little book, Where is God in a Coronavirus World, that's available in many languages, and you can have if you like.
Thank you so much, John. And I don't know about anybody else, but I am really enjoying this conversation. But it's time to open it up to questions. I can see we've got a lot of questions that have come in. Louise, do you want to take us through the first one?
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, I did have to interrupt everybody else earlier, so it's only really fair if I interrupt you two now, isn't it? Yeah, please do keep texting in your questions as we go. If any of the answers or any of the other questions pique some interest for you, they will still keep coming to us. But I will start with one that's already here, which is, so some people believe that there are aliens in outer space. And if someone would say to them, "Oh, that seems a bit out there," they'd say, "Well, it's only the same as Christians believing in God." So what would you say to those two statements? How would you approach those?
Well, I would approach it by saying it's not just the same. It's the same in one sense, that I believe that there are other intelligences in the universe, and the biggest one is God. But the evidence for the existence of God is there. I believe it. The evidence for the existence of aliens is not there, certainly not as yet. And it was very interesting for me one time to have a discussion with Paul Davies, a brilliant physicist, whose books are always well worth reading, who wrote a book called Are We Alone? And he says that as a human being, he was hoping that we're not alone, but as a scientist, he tended to feel we were alone. So the universe is far more complex than we think. And certainly you are correct in the implication of what the questioner says is the Bible claims there are other intelligences. The word alien tends to imply something negative. And there are negative intelligences, but there are angels, there are positive intelligences. And we know so little about that world that speculation is absolutely rife. I'm not going to speculate, but when I was asked in a radio interview on Davis's book if I believed in extraterrestrial intelligence, I said, of course I do. There's one very big one called God, which resonates exactly with the point your questioner made.
One of the questions that has come in, John, that a number of people have asked is just whether there have been any scientific theories or discoveries that you found have challenged your faith or really stretched your faith through the course of your career.
Do you mean my faith in God?
Your faith in God, yeah.
Or my faith in science?
Your faith in your faith in God.
We must get this faith question straight.
Please do. Straighten it for us.
Not really, because you see, science is trying to elucidate the facts about the world, and it's the interpretation of those facts that can be used by many people, as you know, to challenge the existence of God. But in my life so far, what I have found is that all my experience of science actually increases my faith in God. You see, coming back to a point I made a lot earlier, that faith that science can be done, the fundamental faith of every scientist, is buttressed strongly, as I mentioned with the founders of modern science, by belief in God as an intelligent creator. And so the very fact that I can do mathematics and that mathematics helps us to understand the universe is a very powerful evidence to my mind, as is, if you want to come to the results rather than the philosophy of science, the fine tuning of the universe evidence. So I would want to know from you what results you had in mind. You just said, have I found any? The answer is no, but that's possibly because I haven't come across any.
All right, fantastic. Just a reminder as well for those of you on the live stream, you can still keep texting in to let us know where you are and how many people you're with. That would be brilliant. Back to the questions, though. Here's one. If we had a blank slate in the whole science and faith debate, for want of a better way of putting it, how do you think the fundamentals that underpin science would be redefined? And how do you think religion could be redefined? So I think that's if we didn't have kind of any of the background that we've currently got in either field, how could we go about defining them at the moment?
Well, I fear that's the kind of hypothetical question that's unanswerable. What I would say is that if you look at the Times, I think it was on Saturday, you will discover that the percentage of people in the UK that believe that science and religion are essentially compatible has just about doubled in the last 10 years. And the effect of the new atheist onslaught via Dawkins and so on has attenuated massively. What do we mean by a blank slate? Nobody starts with a blank slate. That's a myth. We all have our prejudices and we hope they're informed, but they're not necessarily so. And we can only begin where we are, so we can't clear the area. But what we can do in that direction, and I spent my whole life doing it, which is why I'm speaking to you today, and that is we can be self-critical. We can put ourselves under questioning. The late, brilliant Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman used to say, bend over backwards in your self-criticism because the easiest person for you to fool is yourself. And I have spent my life deliberately, right from the first week or two in Cambridge, deliberately exposing my belief in God to questioning sometimes friendly, sometimes very hostile, because I was concerned to get to know the truth. And my convictions, they've been built up not by remaining in a capsule, but by getting out of my comfort zone and talking to people who don't share my world view. But you see, the last point I would make here, how would we define religion? Well, religion is a general category, and Christianity doesn't really fit into it in the sense that religion is often defined to be rules and regulations that human beings have made up to approach a God whom they've made up. And they follow various rules and regulations in the hope that God will eventually accept them one day. Christianity is not religion in that sense, because Christianity is not human beings reaching up to God, it's God reaching down to them and offering them a relationship with Him that is not, as in the vast majority of religions, based on human merit, but it's based on God's gift of grace. And that's a hugely different ballpark. I'm not remotely interested in defining religion. I'm interested in knowing what's true about the universe and the world and what is evidence-based. And I've come to the conclusion that there's strong evidence not only that there is a God, but that He has revealed Himself in Jesus Christ. And I can enjoy and have enjoyed for many years now a relationship with Him that I can bring into my science and into my everyday life, my marriage, my home, my children, and all of that.
So the question that a number of people have asked is very much connected with what you've just been talking about there, John, which is essentially, how do you know that Christianity is the right answer to this? Because in some ways you could just say in answer to the question that we're asking, can science explain everything? Well, no. But that doesn't mean that Christianity is any more true. And with the different options that are out there and available, why would Christianity be any more true than any of the other options? And I guess someone might say to you, well, John, you're just echoing what you grew up with, the worldview the framework that you grew up with. So how do you know that it's Christianity that's specifically the answer to this?
Well, there are two very separate questions there. The second of your questions, I grew up with it, so therefore I believe it is a Freudian argument, and I was challenged with it very early in my university days. And it was for that reason that I decided deliberately to get to know students of my own era, so to speak, who didn't share my worldview. And it was very important for me to see that could change their worldview. And I've seen that many times, of course. Now, if the thesis that people remain in the religion where they were brought up were true, Christianity would never have got started, because it was a radical departure from Judaism, where the disciples, most of them, had grown up. But the substantive question here can only be answered on the basis of evidence. Christianity, how do I know it's true? Well, the only thing I can do is what I do in every other area of life, including science, and that is test the claims. Now, let's give an example of this. I have friends in most religions thinking about one of the central things in our discussion this evening, the central claim of Christianity that Jesus rose from the dead, that He died and rose again. Well, now, my Jewish friends believe that He died and did not rise. My Muslim friends believe that He didn't die. Now, all three of those things cannot be simultaneously true. We all know that. So how are you going to decide it? On the basis of evidence, which is why what I try to do in my life is to lay down the evidence and encourage people to do what is massively important, and what I was allowed to do as a child and throughout life is to make up their own mind on the basis of the evidence, to do with the factual and historical things. But there's another way, it seems to me, of approaching this. If I'm asked and pushed, as I think you are pushing me to a certain extent, what is it makes the real difference? Well, I hinted at it in the last answer. It's that Christianity is not a religion in the sense that people expect it to be. What I mean by that is, many people, when they're asked to define religion, which was another question, say, well, generally speaking, religion has an initiation ceremony or process. Then there's a way which is prescribed for you to follow. And you have various teachers, imams, gurus, priests, etc., to guide you. But then ultimately, you're going to come to an assessment by God. And at that point, none of these teachers can help you, because whether you achieve enough in your life in doing good things or not depends entirely on your merit. Now, if that's religion, Christianity is simply not a religion. It's actually the exact opposite of that. Now, let me explain that, because it is amazing to my mind how many people think Christianity is like that. And it's why they give up, because they think that in front of them are being set rules far more than New Year resolutions. And they try to keep the Sermon on the Mount or something for a week or two, and they despair. They find they haven't got the power to do it, and they simply give up. But you see, Christianity is very different from that. What it does, what Christ does, is he offers me acceptance, not at the end of the journey, at the day of judgment, but at the beginning of the journey. Because in his death, he's done something very deep, and it has deep and mysterious elements to it. But he has, as the claim that is embodied in his name, he shall save his people from their sins. And I understand that to mean, in some amazing way, Jesus on the cross paid the penalty that I could never pay for the mess I've made of my own life, let alone the mess I've made of other people's lives. And if I trust him, I receive forgiveness in that moment, so that I now live not in order to merit God's acceptance, but because I've got it. Now, that is such a revolutionary thing that many people don't understand it. And I often illustrate it by saying that on my second day at Cambridge, I met a very delightful looking young woman. And eventually I said, I would like you to marry me. So I gave her a present, and it was a cookbook. And I opened it at page 203 and showed her the recipe for apple cake. And I said, I love apple cake. So you see the various rules. Take so much flour, so much sugar, so many apples, and all this kind of thing. Mix them together with a few sultanas, put them in an oven, and cook them at a certain temperature. Now I say, it's going to be like this. If you keep these rules accurately for, let's say, the next 30 or 40 years, I don't want to be too tough, then I will accept you. Well, any girl faced with that would throw the book at me and probably murder me as well. And we laugh at that. I said, this is absolutely absurd. But now comes the crunch. Many people think of God exactly like that. They treat God, who is a person, in a way they'd never treat any human being. In other words, they think that God makes acceptance dependent on merit. Now, of course, I didn't do that to the girl who's been my wife for 53 years now, because you see, she accepted me at the beginning for some reason, and I accepted her. And the secret and the strength of our marriage relationship has been not that I'm constantly looking for her satisfying certain laws, but because that loving acceptance was there at the beginning. Now that makes sense. And therefore it makes perfect sense when I find that God is like that, but religion very rarely depicts him like that. And the reason, and let me put this very carefully, the reason I'm a Christian is that Christ offers me something no other religion offers me. And therefore it's not arrogant to accept from him what no other religion offers me. He doesn't compete with anybody else because no other philosophy or religion offers me forgiveness, acceptance on the basis not of my merit, but of something God has done at the very beginning of my relationship with God and not at the final judgment. This is a radical difference. And that principle of God's forgiveness and love and grace is utterly profound. And it's what really defines me as a Christian.
That's amazing. This is the point at which I really want to ask another question, because we've got an amazing list of questions, and thank you so much for sending them all in. But unfortunately, we don't really have time. So actually what I'm going to do is thank Andy very, very much for a wonderful interview and some very insightful and thoughtful questions, and thank John very, very much for some very thoughtful and insightful answers. Would we like to thank them in the room, perhaps? Wonderful. And I do have one more task for us all to do together. It's going to be lovely before you go. If we can have the QR code back up on screen, please. That's wonderful. Thank you. Please, if you have not filled in our feedback form, if you can do it right now. If you're on YouTube, there should be a link in the video description, so just underneath your video, that says Linktree/Science and Faith. If you go to there, the top button is for our feedback form. It should only take 2 minutes, so you should pretty much get to filling it in whilst I'm wrapping up, and I will just look at a sea of phones rather than faces. It's great. Thank you so much for being with us. We really hope that you took something away from this and that it's spurred extra thought and lots for you to mull. We do have more events coming up, which is really exciting. Next month, we have Dr. Ruth Valerio coming to talk to us about why climate change matters. That's on the 24th, and you will find on the very same link tree a button that will take you to scienceandfaith.co.uk, where you can find event information and tickets for that one, as well as event information for the rest of the events coming up over the year. So we really hope that one or several of those is intriguing to you, and that we'll see you then. And that's it from us. Thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, thank you.